Hi everyone. I'm a 36M, and I've been working as a teacher for almost 10 years. Honestly, my life always felt routine. Wake up early, head to school, teach a bunch of rowdy kids, come home tired, and try to unwind before doing it all again the next day. I'm not some fancy corporate type or a big shot in any industry. I'm just a regular guy who thought he had a somewhat stable life. I've been married for 7 years, and until recently, I would have told you my marriage was okay. Nothing perfect, but nothing that set off huge alarms. Turns out I was dead wrong about that. I started noticing I was constantly run down around 6 months ago. My head felt like it was in a vice, my stomach was always upset, and I just couldn't shake this weird sense that something was really off with my body. At first, I blamed stress. Teaching can be intense, right? Germs fly around the classroom all the time, and teachers get sick pretty regularly. But no matter how much I rested or tried to eat healthy, I got worse. My skin looked pale, I lost weight, and I had zero energy. It felt like something was slowly eating away at me from the inside. My father was the one who insisted I see a doctor. He's retired, has plenty of free time, and apparently also has a knack for telling me when I look like crap. So I went in for a full checkup, expecting them to say I had an ulcer or some vitamin deficiency. But the news I got was way more messed up. They found trace amounts of a poisonous substance in my system, something that typically indicates long-term low-dose exposure. The doctor asked me a bunch of questions, and the more he described the substance, the more I realized it wasn't an accident. Someone was feeding me poison bit by bit. It was the kind of wake-up call that makes your brain just stall. I remember trying to come up with reasons why someone would do that to me. Did I piss off a student's parent? Did some coworker have a crazy grudge? Nothing made sense. For a while, I refused to believe anyone in my immediate circle was behind it. But the truth is, when you're being systematically poisoned, it's almost always someone close. That thought alone freaked me out, and my father, being the direct, no-nonsense guy he is, pushed me to start looking at the people in my life more critically. My wife was the obvious suspect, even though I hated thinking it. She was the one cooking for me most of the time. We'd been arguing more than usual over finances, but I never imagined she'd be capable of something like attempted murder. Still, the doctor's report didn't lie. I had poison in my bloodstream. I couldn't just ignore it. I decided to hire a private investigator. It felt extreme, but I didn't have enough evidence to go to the police. All I had was a blood test showing poison, no proof of who was slipping it to me. So I contacted this investigator, a guy my father found through an old buddy. He'd been a cop in a bigger city before, so he knew what he was doing. We worked out a deal, and he started following my wife's daily routines, checking phone records, all that stuff. Meanwhile, I took every precaution I could think of at home. I stopped eating my wife's cooking whenever she wasn't literally watching me take each bite, and even then, sometimes I faked a taste, complimented her, and then quietly ditched the food later. I switched to takeout or microwavable stuff and stashed it in a mini fridge in the garage, just to avoid suspicion. She definitely noticed my odd behavior. She'd ask why I wasn't eating her meals, and I'd make excuses. My stomach's messed up, or the doctor said to go on a bland diet. Sometimes she'd get really pushy, insisting I drink the soup she'd made. Other times, she'd give me this dead-eyed stare that gave me chills. I started to sense something dark behind her eyes, like she knew I might be onto her. But I couldn't tip my hand without proof. As the investigator dug deeper, I felt my anxiety go through the roof. I couldn't sleep, and every time I shut my eyes, I pictured her leaning over my food with some vile substance. It was insane how quickly I went from trusting her to feeling like I was living with a stranger who wanted me dead. The tension in the house was suffocating. We'd fight over stupid things, too, like me not cleaning the dishes or her complaining we didn't have enough money to go on a decent vacation. In the back of my mind, I kept wondering if she'd up the dose of poison if she got pissed enough. When the private investigator finally called me to arrange a meeting, I almost threw up from nerves. We met at this old diner on the edge of town. He slid a folder across the table and told me to be prepared for some dark stuff. I flipped it open and saw photos of my wife meeting her mother, my mother-in-law. I never liked that woman much. She always pressured us to live in a bigger house, drive nicer cars, and basically live beyond our means. According to the investigator, she was the one who originally planted the idea of cashing out on my life insurance. I saw transcripts of phone calls where they talked about timing, dosages, and how they needed to be patient to make it look like I died from a natural illness. Reading that made me feel sick, like I'd stepped into a horror movie starring my own wife and her mother. Turns out, my wife had taken out a bigger life insurance policy on me a couple of years back, right around the time my mother-in-law started pushing for a more extravagant lifestyle. They'd been plotting for months, even discussing details about how to dispose of any leftover poison. The investigator even had a few recordings where my mother-in-law was bitching about how I wasn't a big earner, like I was some obstacle standing between them and a flashy life. In one call, she literally told my wife that once I was gone, they could move to a better area and stop living like peasants. I was shaking with anger and betrayal. Part of me still didn't want to believe my wife could do this, but the evidence was right there. The investigator cautioned me not to confront her directly just yet. If I blew up, she might go on the run or deny everything, and I'd be left with a messy, unconfirmed case. So we decided to keep gathering more proof. He advised me to set up hidden cameras, keep records of every interaction, and basically treat my own house like a surveillance operation. The scariest part was continuing to live under the same roof as this woman who was actively trying to kill me. My father, who's always been protective, wanted me to move in with him immediately. He was worried one slip could mean the end for me, but the private investigator argued that if I vanished from the house, my wife would know I was onto her. We needed an airtight case to make sure she and her mother actually faced consequences. So I stayed. I'd pretend to eat dinner, slip half of it to the trash, or sometimes accidentally knock over a glass if she tried to hand me something. My heart pounded every time I walked into that kitchen. We set up a hidden camera in a corner behind some decorative junk. I was paranoid she'd find it, but she seemed too cocky or too oblivious to think I'd suspect anything. I recorded hours of footage, hoping to catch her spiking my food. Meanwhile, the investigator kept tailing her. He got pictures of her going into a sketchy shop known for selling chemicals under the counter. She'd come out with small bottles, stash them in her purse, and then drive straight home. The next day, my father and the investigator showed me those photos, and I felt a jolt of rage. It was all so real, so calculated. Then came the moment that convinced me we had to move fast. My wife outright asked me to increase my life insurance. She framed it as being worried about what would happen if I got in a car crash or something. She whined about how she'd be stuck with a mortgage, and how she didn't want to rely on her mother forever. Listening to her talk about me basically dying made my stomach flip. I played dumb, nodded along, said I'd look into it. A couple of weeks later, the investigator discovered something else. My wife and her mother had a deadline. They wanted me gone before summer ended so they could collect the insurance money and sell the house during the peak real estate season. I can't even describe how it felt to realize they'd put a fucking deadline on my life. That's the moment I decided we had to confront them and bring in the cops. We weren't just dealing with suspicion anymore. We had receipts, video evidence, audio recordings, and phone transcripts. The private investigator told me to plan a family dinner where I'd confront them. My father agreed to be there for support, and the PI would coordinate with the police in case anything went crazy. The plan was to invite my wife's mother, my mother-in-law, over to my house so we'd have them both in the same room. I'd then show them the evidence, get them to freak out, and the cops would storm in. It felt like something out of a crime drama. The day of, my father came over first. We double-checked the recording devices and made sure we had everything in place. I was sweating bullets, trying to act normal while waiting for my wife and her mother to arrive. They walked in, all smiles. My mother-in-law had her usual superiority complex vibe going on. She immediately made some snarky comment about our cheap furniture, which I ignored. My wife pretended to be cheerful, kissing me on the cheek, acting like everything was fine. My father was polite but chilly. We pretended to sit down for dinner, but I could barely eat. My mind was spinning, thinking, these two have been slowly poisoning me, and here they are complaining about the damn living room decor. Halfway through the meal, I got up and suggested we all move to the living room. My father stood behind me. That was my cue to open the folder of evidence I'd prepared and press play on the first audio recording. It filled the room with my wife's voice talking about mixing poison into my meals. Then I flipped through pictures of her visiting that shady shop and transcripts where my mother-in-law encouraged her to increase the dosage. The atmosphere turned ice cold. My wife's face went pale. My mother-in-law started screaming that we'd faked everything, that we were trying to frame them. I kept playing more recordings, phone conversations between the two of them, discussing the day I dropped dead and how they'd get the insurance payout. My father stood there with his arms crossed, looking like he wanted to punch something. My wife tried to grab my phone out of my hand, but I stepped back. She shouted that I was twisting the truth. She accused me of being a terrible husband who didn't earn enough money. Her mother piped in, saying I was holding her daughter back from the luxurious life she deserved. I told them both to shut up and listen, explaining that I had hidden cameras, a private investigator, and all the evidence needed to go to the police. They kept yelling, tears streaming down my wife's face, while her mother insulted me and my father. She said we were petty losers who didn't know how to treat a woman. My wife tried to push past my father to run upstairs, maybe to destroy evidence, but he blocked her path. Right on cue, the front door opened, and in walked two police officers with a private investigator. My wife and mother-in-law flipped out, saying this was illegal, that we had no right to record them. The cops weren't buying it. They listened to enough of the recordings to detain both of them on the spot. My wife started crying louder, accusing me of betrayal. Her mother, on the other hand, was just furious, hurling insults and threatening to sue everyone in sight. The cops handcuffed them, read them their rights, and marched them out of the one of my neighbors peeked through her curtains like she was watching a soap opera. I didn't even care that it looked like a circus. I was just relieved to finally have them exposed for what they were trying to do. After they were gone, I sat down on the couch, feeling like I just sprinted a marathon. My father put a hand on my shoulder and said, "You did the right thing." It felt surreal. The woman I married was now in handcuffs for attempting to kill me. I was pissed, sad, numb, and weirdly relieved all at once. The legal aftermath was a whirlwind. The evidence was overwhelming. The police found traces of the poison in our kitchen, some stashed away in a cupboard behind cleaning supplies. My wife and mother-in-law were charged with conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, and a bunch of related offenses. My wife tried to argue for bail, claiming she was innocent, and this was all a misunderstanding, but the judge wouldn't grant it after hearing the recordings. She was deemed a flight risk. My mother-in-law was also denied bail. My wife's father, my father-in-law, was completely clueless about the plot. When he heard about it, he basically lost his mind. He apologized to me personally, telling me he had no idea they were that twisted. He cut ties with both of them, humiliated that they resorted to murder for cash. It was bizarre watching him break down in front of me, saying he'd always found them shallow but never thought they'd commit such a crime. For a while, I was scared about how this could affect my job. Teachers are supposed to have it together, right? I didn't want rumors flying around about my personal life, but I kept my head low at work, told a few close colleagues I was dealing with some serious personal issues, and left it at that. My father helped me change the locks on my house and install better security cameras. I found more incriminating stuff hidden in the house after I started packing her belongings. She had notes on how to up the dosage to speed up the process. I handed all of it over to the private investigator, who passed it along to the police. The court proceedings dragged on, but eventually, the prosecutor offered a plea deal to my wife if she would testify against her mother, who seemed to be the main instigator. They'd apparently conspired together, but the mother-in-law pushed a lot of it from the start. My wife ended up confessing, trying to reduce her sentence by throwing her mother under the bus. I didn't care who got the blame. I wanted both of them behind bars for a long time. The judge seemed to agree. They both faced serious prison time, with my wife's mother getting the harsher punishment as the ringleader. It felt like some twisted victory. On one hand, I was relieved they'd be out of my life. On the other hand, I was shaken that I'd been living next to someone who'd watch me eat poison and then ask if I wanted dessert. The betrayal cut deep, and it took me a while to wrap my head around it. My father, bless him, was there every step of the way, making sure I took care of myself, ate real food, and didn't spiral into depression. In the end, dealing with the fallout was tough, but also gave me a new sense of freedom. I was alive, for starters. That alone felt like a huge gift. I focused on my teaching, decided to get more involved with after-school programs, and put my energy into shaping the next generation rather than dwelling on the crap I went through. My soon-to-be ex-wife tried to send me letters from jail, basically blaming her mother or whining that she didn't really mean for it to get that bad. I ignored them. She could rot in there for all I cared. I'm sharing this on Reddit because people need to know that reality can be way darker than you'd ever expect. If something feels really off, like you're sick all the time without explanation, don't just brush it off as stress. And if a partner or relative constantly harps on money and makes you uncomfortable, take that seriously. I never thought my wife was capable of trying to kill me. I felt like we were a normal couple with normal arguments. But greed makes people do insane things, and some folks are just twisted enough to go through with it. I guess the biggest piece of advice I have is trust your instincts. If I hadn't listened to that gnawing feeling, I might not be alive right now. Hiring a private investigator felt extreme, but it turned out to be the smartest move I ever made. Without solid evidence, I would have been the guy with a crazy story no one believed. Now I'm the guy who caught a literal murder plot on tape. Life hasn't magically gone back to sunshine and roses, but I'm rebuilding. My father keeps telling me I deserve better, and yeah, I do. It's going to take time to process all of this. I still get nightmares about being poisoned in my sleep. But at least the worst is over, and the people responsible are behind bars, facing the consequences of their entitlement and greed. I got my revenge by pulling the rug out from under them before they had the chance to finish me off. The look on their faces when the cops walked in was the most satisfying moment of my life. So there it is. I'm living proof that sometimes the biggest threats come from people closest to you. I'm not sharing this story for pity or attention, but to warn anyone who might be ignoring red flags in their own life. Don't sleep on that weird gut feeling. Don't let anyone, spouse, relative, whoever, treat you like you're disposable. Protect yourself, even if it means doing things that feel paranoid or over the top. Because at the end of the day, your life is worth more than anyone else's greed or bullshit sense of entitlement. Anyway, thanks for reading if you made it this far. I know it's a lot to take in. Part of me still can't believe this happened, but I'm grateful to be here, able to share it. Take care of yourselves, and if your gut ever says something's wrong, listen. It might save your life.